Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. Today, we're looking at a quote, a meme that I have seen bubble up many times on social media, and I want to unpack whether this is actually accurate. This question of at what point did we start calling the president of the church the prophet? How did that kind of, because I've had people ask me this question just as a research question they're asking me to dig into. They've heard, maybe they've seen the same quote of like, hey, I think it's kind of a recent thing where we call the leader of the church the prophet, our prophet, prophetic council, etc. Whereas they've heard, and I've been asked to figure out, like, did we not always used to do that? When did things change, and why? So the quote I'm referencing, I've seen it from this image from a website called wasmormon.org. This is like an kind of anti-ex Mormon website that they produced this image, but it's got this quote attributed to Dr. D. Michael Quinn. Of course, they have to put the doctor in there to bolster the legitimacy here. And the quote says, "Mormons have not always seen their president as a prophet. Before 1955, every mention of the church's leader in Deseret News articles referred to him as president. The honorific prophet was reserved only for Joseph Smith, the church's founder, and prophets from the Bible and the Book of Mormon. Yet, during David O. McKay's popular presidency from 1951 to 1970, church publications began occasionally referring to him as prophet. By the late 1960s, president had become interchangeable, if not synonymous, with prophet, thanks to routine references to the latter in church publications and at general conferences." That is a claim that I've seen, a quote attributed to Dr. D. Michael Quinn many times through this image and other things that have been shared online. It turns out that Quinn, and by the way, Quinn is he was a historian. He passed away, I think, like 4 years ago. He was part of the September 6th, six who were excommunicated. I plan at some point to do a musing looking at those folks and what went down there. So he was wrapped up in that. He got excommunicated. He lived openly gay after that. He was still kind of a believing Mormon, but very, widely respected in the historian community as a good, professional historian. So he's written several books, and I'll mention one in just a minute. But it turns out that this quote that is being shared from this website attributed to Quinn did not actually come from him. The text in that image, the text that's being shared around the internet, comes from a gentleman named Neil Young, who is a scholar and a historian who in 2007 wrote an essay for the American Quarterly Journal titled "The ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, is a Moral Issue: The Mormon Church, LDS Women, and the Defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment." So that is the context of this scholarly article. This gentleman, Neil Young, is talking about how opposition to the ERA was firmed up as church members began to see the president as the prophet and therefore fell in line. So in the article, Young points out examples in which church members were kind of ignoring the preferences and the statements of the president of the church, because the argument goes, oh, well, it's just the president of the church, therefore I can do what I want, right? So you've got, Heber Grant on prohibition, right, pushing the saints to vote for prohibition, and then Utah, right, goes the other way and he's upset. Or electing FDR because lots of, rural farmer Mormons want the free, tax dollars, the gravy train with the New Deal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The point that Young is making in this article is that when members of the church perceived their leader as president, his opinions were his own and it was easier to dispense with them. But with the Equal Rights Amendment and this transition, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, the contention in this article is that that's when the church leaders started swapping out the term president for prophet and using them synonymously, thereby bolstering the opinions of the church leader and making it hard for members to diverge from them because this is the prophet, right? And that's the argument in this essay. Here's the quote from this article in American Quarterly in 2007. Mormons have not always seen their president as a prophet. Before 1955, D. Michael Quinn notes that every mention of the church's leader in Deseret News articles referred to him as president. The honorific prophet was reserved only for Joseph Smith, the church's founder, and prophets from the Bible and the Book of Mormon. Yet during David, okay, so you get the point, right? That this quote in this image that's being attributed to Quinn is not from Quinn. It is from Neil Young, who does reference Quinn, but this quote is not Quinn's. This Neil Young guy is referencing Quinn to support his, description of things, and provides citations in his article pointing to Quinn's book. I'll mention in just a moment. But it's laughable. It's probably not surprising to see kind of an website playing fast and loose with the facts in order to kind of bolster their point with Dr. D. Michael Quinn. What I find interesting, a couple points about this quote, and then we'll move on. First, it's the claim is D. Michael Quinn notes that every mention of the church's leader in Deseret News articles referred to him as president. Well, I didn't review the Deseret News extensively, but I did look through a lot of articles, and I found a number before 1955 when the church leader, the president, was not always referred to that way. Here, for example, from 1941 is Elder Jacobs. He's the former president of the Palestine-Syrian mission. And in this article, in the Deseret News, you can see on the lower right, may Heavenly Father bless our prophet and president and his associates. So it's at least using both, again, making that point perhaps of their interchangeability. But this is from the Deseret News in 1941. So again, Neil Young and apparently D. Michael Quinn are claiming that every mention of the church leader in the Deseret News prior to 1955 only refers to him as president. Let's go back a few years prior. Here is from 1936, Elder Alfred Reese of the General Sunday School Board, under the title, When a Prophet Speaks. We see down below, it is true that in song, in verse, and in speech, we hail the leader of our church as our prophet. We sing paeans of praise to the Father of us all, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a reference to not our president, but our prophet in 1936. Let's fast forward closer to the 1955 that is referenced in the article, referenced apparently by D. Michael Quinn. This is 1952. This is a letter from George A. Smith to Wilford Woodruff. And you can see this paragraph, Brother Haywood is more comfortable today, blah, blah, blah. I am fine company, rejoicing under the guidance of men appointed by our prophet Brigham. Okay, so again, this claim from Neil Young, being supported apparently by Quinn, is that every mention of the church's leader in Deseret News articles refers to him as president. I've just shared just a few. There are more. So that's not true, that every mention, right? And then it further says the honorific prophet was reserved only for Joseph Smith, the church's founder. Again, I just showed that is not true. So what do we do with that? What does that actually mean? Well, let's go to Quinn's actual claim. Let's forget about this Neil Young guy. He's citing Michael Quinn as the authority for having discovered this result from his research. What I'm going to now read from is from Quinn's book, The Mormon Hierarchy, Extensions of Power. This is the cited reference in Neil Young's article where he's saying Quinn said all this stuff. So let's go, let's read a paragraph or two from the book, and then we'll talk about it. Under the heading Adoration of the LDS President, here's what Quinn says. By the mid-1950s, a change was underway in Mormonism that profoundly affected its political influence. The hierarchy and church publications encouraged an unprecedented adoration of Church President David O. McKay. His, quote, graceful, witty manner, his imposing physical appearance, his deep warmth, all made people see him as the prophet to be classed with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Extensive television broadcasts of two general conferences annually after 1953 heightened Mackay's personal and ceremonial impact on members of the church. By the late 1960s, LDS publications and speakers routinely identified Mackay as the prophet, our prophet, and beloved prophet. Those terms had previously applied to the martyred prophet Joseph Smith, while the living LDS president had simply been, quote, the president. All right, let's pause there and go to the footnote that Quinn himself uses to support this claim that those terms, prophet, our prophet, beloved prophet, previously only applied to Joseph while everyone else had been president. Now, Quinn, in the footnote for that claim, does say and concede, he says, there were occasions when pre-Mackay presidents were called, quote, the prophet. However, they were exceptions. So right there, Quinn is saying something that this Neil Young gentleman and that this meme claiming Quinn said all this stuff is totally wrong about, because the meme, the quote, the ERA article say, oh, the only times this was reserved only for Joseph Smith, every mention of a church leader, right? And it's got this very bold claim that there's no exceptions to, right? So in this footnote, Quinn also cites a 1995 study that was done by some history grad at the University of, I think it was Utah, where they studied conference reports between 1950 and 1970, and then discourses, analyzing references to prophet. So again, all of this in support of the claim that the term prophet prior to 1955 was only being used to apply to Joseph Smith. More on that analysis of general conference addresses in just a moment. I have a lot to share there, but let's continue on for a moment with Quinn. He continues in his book and says that changing devotional status of the LDS president can be dated precisely through the official church news. Published weekly by the Deseret News since 1931, every headline reference of church news to each LDS president referred to him as president until 1955. During those 24 years, no headline referred to the living LDS president as prophet, and that term was used exclusively to refer to Joseph Smith or to prophets of the Bible and Book of Mormon. In February 1955, the Church News published the first headline reference to the living LDS president as the prophet. There's a couple important things to note here. First is that Quinn's research, his contention, is solely based on the official church news, published weekly by the Deseret News since 1931. And yet, the quote from Neil Young does not say anything about church news, and therefore the meme that's been, claiming that Quinn said this says nothing about church news. Again, the claim made by this young scholar guy says Quinn notes that every mention of the church's leader in Deseret News articles refers to him as president. So that's not what Quinn said in his book, which is the basis for this young guy for his article. Quinn isn't saying every Deseret News article, and yet that's what it's been turned into by Young. Wasn't every Deseret News article. Quinn is talking about official church news, which is published weekly. The Deseret News publishes a lot more stuff beyond just that weekly church news, including some of the images that I shared and read from just a moment ago, where in the Deseret News, they're talking about our prophet or the prophet, and not meaning Joseph Smith, but instead meaning the president of the church at the time. Quinn isn't talking about every Deseret News article. He's talking only about the church news. He's also constraining it not to the church news generally speaking. He's constraining his observation only to headline references. That's interesting, because that's very selective and heavily editorial. Right? He's not saying, oh yeah, in the fourth paragraph, whatever, and they say he's not reading this voluminous text, right? Kind of makes sense. Pre-internet, whatever, you're doing a lot of this research, you're having to sift down a little bit somehow and not read whatever, millions of words and so forth. So he's only limiting his inquiry to church news and to headlines of the articles. Okay, so then he says, in February 1955, the church news published the first headline reference to the living LDS president as the prophet. So again, he's not saying that at no point previously has the church news mentioned at any point our prophet or the prophet. He's saying only the headline reference. Now, here is that example that he mentioned from February 1955. The scan is very poor, so the photo doesn't come through well, but that is President David McKay wearing some leis. The heading, the headline that Quinn is referencing in the footer there at the bottom says, "A prophet visits the island nations." Now, interestingly, it does not say the prophet or our prophet, which are terms that become used more heavily in the decades to come after this. It says a prophet. And there were other uses at the time previous to this that acknowledged living leaders as a prophet in the church news, in the Deseret news, in General Conference. They were less common, as I'll get into in just a moment, but there was kind of a little bit of a distinction between a prophet, President David McKay, because, they're just being sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators. So there's a distinction between saying, he's a prophet versus the prophet, right? Excuse me. Okay, and what's interesting is that little paragraph down there at the bottom calls him President David O. McKay, right? It's not saying our prophet, David O. McKay, or the prophet. It's just this editorial headline choice that Quinn is using to pinpoint like an inflection point in 1955. Quinn does concede that references to McKay as prophet or the prophet were slow going. He's also saying that they are for political reasons, which is where Neil Young is going with the ERA. And so they're both Quinn and then Young are kind of making this point that, it seems to be for some political advantage that there's this shift in saying that, the leader of the church is the prophet. Here's from Quinn. He says, "A week after the announcement on 23rd January 1970 that the 12 chose Joseph Fielding Smith as the new church president, a church news editorial headline proclaimed, 'Another prophet is sent.' After the solemn assembly sustained him to that position the following April, a church news story about President Smith was headlined, 'The Prophet.' Thus, Joseph Fielding Smith was the first LDS president identified by headlines of the church news as the prophet throughout his administration. This practice intensified for his successors." All right, that is from the Quinn book on the Mormon hierarchy, Extensions of Power. Here, for example, is that January publication in the church news editorial saying another prophet is sent. This is from the editorial page. What's interesting is it's in quotes. It's not just saying another prophet is sent. If you look at the first part of the editorial, it says, "The saints have sung as one of their favorite hymns, 'Come, listen to a prophet's voice, and hear the word of God, and in the way of truth rejoice and sing for joy aloud. We found the way the prophets went, who lived in days of yore. Another prophet now is sent, this knowledge to restore.'" If we keep reading, it says, "As we have sung this hymn, we have honored the prophet Joseph Smith, who was raised up by act of God, living gloriously in the face of great opposition, finally sealed his testimony with his blood. But other prophets came to succeed him, from President Brigham Young to President David O. McKay, and now still another prophet is raised up from the same family as our original prophet, Joseph Smith. He's, a grandnephew of the prophet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." So this is even acknowledging and conceding that, like the founding prophet Joseph Smith, the prophet, it's wrapping in quotes this title, "Another prophet is sent," which in my mind diminishes it from how Quinn is looking at it. He's looking at it as this like substantive evidence that, look, Joseph Fielding is being called the prophet, and it's this big shift. When the article itself is saying, we've been seeing this for a long time, and we call these successive leaders, and it calls them President Brigham Young, President David O. McKay, right? And we call them a prophet, not the prophet or our prophet, etc. So in my mind, that kind of lessens the potency of this article relative to how Quinn seems to be perceiving it. And then he pointed out that after he was sustained, Joseph Fielding Smith, to that position, he says that there was a church news story about President Smith that was headlined, quote, "The Prophet." Well, that's not really true. It was headlined, as you can see here, quote, "She wasn't lost, she was with the prophet." So yes, the words "the prophet" do appear, but it's not really what Quinn is suggesting. I don't know. Again, to me, he's like focusing on this a little bit. He's reading into it a little more than there is. Now, I do kind of agree with his overarching point. There was a transition of this term being used. We'll talk about some examples in just a moment. This article, by the way, is just a story of, after Joseph Fielding Smith is getting sustained, he leaves. There's a crowd wanting to hear him, or see him rather. There's this little 4-year-old girl that is there. She kind of gets lost for a moment and then found again, and because she was with 2 of her aunts, but she had slipped away, and they were worried that she was getting lost in the crowd. They find her and they say, "How did you get lost?" And the apparently 4-year-old girl says, "I wasn't lost." And they said, "Who found you?" And allegedly the 4-year-old girl says, "I was in the arms of the prophet." And so that is where this article gets its headline. She wasn't lost, she was with the prophet. So, I mean, Quinn is right in essence that calling Joseph Fielding Smith the prophet was a little bit of a transition and a shift from a prophet, which was the more common reference prior to this, that the honorific the prophet with the word the was more used in reference to Joseph Smith previously, whereas there were references to prophets, seers, and revelators, or a prophet, to subsequent leaders of the church, presidents of the church, including since Brigham Young. Now, it was far less common. So Quinn is right in that right around this time, as we'll talk about, there is a larger shift. But again, he's, I think, reading a little too much into, the headline here isn't the prophet, it's this story, but perhaps the story itself is suggesting that if a 4-year-old girl is saying it, and now that little story starts percolating out into people reading it, and well, out of the mouth of babes, right? So if she's calling Joseph Fielding Smith the prophet, then I'm going to start using that term, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, let's get into some general conference references. So for this part of my research, I went to a resource that I have used and shared in the past. This is ldsgeneralconference.org with hyphens, lds-general-conference.org. This is some guy who's compiled an easy way to search for particular terms throughout general conferences. And so my question was, how often in general conference, because I did a search through the Deseret News and a little bit the church news to look at what Quinn and Young were saying. And as I shared, I found references pre-1955 to our prophet or the prophet, referencing the leader of the church. So now I want to turn to general conference because, again, that was earlier referenced, including in Quinn's citation where he pointed to that history student who looked at conference addresses from 1950 to 1970 in order to substantiate the claim that around 1955 and David O. McKay is when you start to get this shift where we're not calling him the president, we're calling him the prophet. Let's rewind a little bit. This by no means is comprehensive. There are many references of many different types, but I want to give you just a little bit of a sense of how things were going. Let's go back to 1915. Here's where David O. McKay refers to a report given by our president at the opening of this conference. I'm not going to put most or all these as quotes like I do, just because I'm going to just throw a bunch at you. So again, if you're interested in any of this, go to that ldsgeneralconference.org website. You can do your own searching and easily find this stuff. I'm going to save my time of not having to copy and paste 80 things, and I'm just going to throw at you a bunch of little examples. So again, 1915, McKay is referring to our president. 2 years later, Heber J. Grant says, our president. He says, "I rejoice in the fact that Latter-day Saints embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ. They've kept the commandments. They've grown as our president says that he has grown." The following year, Charles Penrose rejoices in the good things that have been given unto us, The words spoken by our president this morning. The following year, Anthony Lund. We have this morning heard from our president. In 1921, Roger Clausen. Now may the Lord bless our president, who has spoken so beautifully and so powerfully to us today. 2 years later, John Widsoe. I feel to rejoice that I had the privilege of hearing the address of our president. 1927, B.H. Roberts refers to the harmony with the spirit of this meeting by reason of what our president has said. If we jump forward a decade, here's Joseph F. Merrill talking about the truth that not only comes from the mouth of our prophet, is also truth that's been established by scientific research, et cetera, except he's referring to Joseph Smith here, not Heber Grant, who was the president of the church at the time. So you see these references pre-1955 to our prophet or the prophet, but Quinn is right here. These were far more prevalent, like almost always in reference to Joseph Smith. Not entirely, not exclusively, but the general cases absolutely were. 1943, J. Reuben Clark, he says, if we set our minds and hearts on carrying out the admonition of our prophet and becoming self-sustaining, and then he goes on. So here he's talking about the current president of the church. That's pre-1955, right? J. Reuben Clark the following year says, our prophet, seer, and revelator. Spencer W. Kimball says the same thing that same year, 1944. This is something you see almost kind of in the transition in the 50s, is they don't just always go from the president to the prophet or our president to our prophet. Some of them start using our prophet, seer, and revelator, or the prophet, seer, and revelator. So it's kind of this maybe softer transition in a way. So 1944, you get some references like that. 1946, John Widsoe talks about following the message given us this morning by our prophet and leader. There were several references like that as well. That was kind of a term of choice by some people for a few years, our prophet and leader. The same year, 1946, Spencer Kimball says Joseph Smith, our prophet. So again, you kind of get this blend in the transition, 40s, 50s, and 60s, where they're all being kind of mixed around. 1947, Henry Moyle talks about being governed by the standards that our prophet has set us here today. J. Reuben Clark the following year, our prophet Joseph Smith. 1952, Harold Lee, I want to be counted as one who loves the Lord and who loves our president. So here we're inching up to 1955, and you start to get some our prophet or the prophet, but there's still a lot of our president or the president. 1955, we got Thomas Muir saying, I believe that the auxiliary organizations of the church, through their officers and teachers, should explain that which is required, blah, 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 in keeping with that which our prophet desires. This is a direct reference to the president of the church at the time. 2 years later, Joseph Wirthlin is the presiding bishop. Joseph L. Wirthlin, not Joseph B. Wirthlin. That is where using a middle initial, in my mind, makes sense and is certainly appropriate, is when you've got two people of similar notoriety, that you, especially relatives, that you need to distinguish between. So Joseph L. Wirthlin is presiding bishop, and so he talks about President McKay, and he says, I'm sure, and then he talks about, Jesus called, suffer the little children to come to me, for such is the kingdom of God. And then Wirthlin says, I am sure that is the attitude and the feeling of our prophet. He also says, I do not ever recall having attended a more inspirational conference. Our prophet has received revelation for our good and benefit. The same year, Bruce McConkie, he talks about the fullness of salvation to which our president referred this morning. This is the same year, same conference. These guys are using both terms, and again, it's kind of interchangeable. The following year, Wirthlin again talks about loyalty to our prophet and all the general authorities. The following year, Wirthlin says, as I listened yesterday to our prophet, but then he also says, our president in the years gone by has traveled to many lands for the purpose of preaching the gospel. Alvin Dyer was an assistant to the Quorum of the 12. Again, we're still in 1959. He says it's his great privilege to be under the inspiration and leadership of our prophet. Another assistant to the Quorum of the 12, John Longden, says that the mantle of authority is now held by our prophet, David O. McKay. So again, Quinn is right. In the post-1955, you start to see the transition. It's not a stark thing. It's not a one and done, right? Now, what's interesting is if you use that tool that I did, the LDS General Conference, and you search for these terms, what you'll see is that the references to our president or the president have a massive decline in the 1960s and the 1970s. I'll say a heavy decline, not massive. When you get into the 80s and the 90s, the references to the president, our president, are very minimal. In the 2000s, it's scant, like almost none. And then in the 2010s and 2020s to date, basically non-existent. So you definitely have this kind of transition starting around in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it goes down and then it craters. And in recent decades, right, you don't hear the leader of the church being called our president at all. That almost sounds weird right now. We're just used to not only our prophet, but our beloved prophet, right? It's like when people pray and they say, our dear, kind, and gracious Heavenly Father. I'm sure you've heard that term, right? It's like this rote memorization of like, these are the characteristics with which I'm going to address Heavenly Father in prayer. And like people like copy and paste, right? And start using that themselves. Similarly, our beloved prophet, it's beloved, right? We've got to use that term. His counsel is prophetic counsel, right? We get these like catchphrases. I did that musing some months ago on changing catchphrases in the church. Okay, so why does any of this matter? Who cares? A few concluding thoughts. I think that words do matter. And, Joseph Smith, right? And when his scribe was writing in his diary, this is February 8th of 1843, a prophet is not always a prophet, only when he is acting as such. And the modern rhetoric of, follow the prophet is usually packaged with a period instead of a comma, which Joseph seems to be suggesting. Follow the prophet, comma, when he is acting as such. We should follow the prophet when he's acting as a true prophet of God. If it's follow the president, that doesn't have as much of a catchy lyric for primary kids, right? Follow the president and his personal opinions, and even though they're well-meaning and well-intentioned and well-informed from a long life, et cetera, we have, and I've addressed this in many musings, this is not a new topic for me, this conflation between president and prophet, this presumption that everything presidential is prophetic. There's a term called semantic satiation. You ever heard of that term before? If you haven't, you've probably experienced it. Like, when you're in the kitchen and you're looking at the toaster and you say toaster and your kid says toaster, and then you say the toaster again and you're looking at the toaster and you're thinking about the toaster and you're like, toasters, it's a weird word. And what does it mean? And there's like some neurological explanation that I went down a rabbit hole trying to understand a while ago. But like something happens in your brain where the meaning between of the word, once you're hearing it with high frequency, starts to dilute. Right? When you say toaster a bunch of times, suddenly the word is just kind of weird. This is semantic satiation. You're satiating your brain with the semantics of that word, right? And so I think it's the same with prophet. Before we go there, think of come follow me, right? We say that term now all the time. Oh, where are we at in come follow me? Oh, I got to do my come follow me. Listen to the come follow me podcast. Hey, which section of the come follow me are we going to read tonight as a family? And this term with frequency, in my estimation, starts to dilute in its potency that we don't. Maybe I'll just speak for myself. Maybe none of you have this problem and my brain is just weird. But for me, as an individual, when I hear come follow me 83,000 times, I don't do well at connecting it to Jesus's words, come follow me, and how potent those words are and what that means and how it should impact my daily life, right? It's kind of like there's temples all over the place here. And when there are, they lose their potency because you're not having to sacrifice as much and drive as far and take time out of your day. And so then the frequency of it kind of dilutes its potency in a sense. So semantic satiation, I feel like the same thing. We use the word prophet so cavalierly when, in my humble estimation, we should be using the term where it applies. I don't like using words that lack meaning and significance. Do I sustain the leaders of the church as prophets, seers, and revelators? 100%. But what does that mean? I sustain them in their capacity to obtain prophecy and to see things and to reveal things on behalf of the church. I sustain them in their positions of authority to have that privilege and potential on behalf of God's kingdom. Does that mean that I agree that everything they say and do is prophetic, is the result of seeing, is revelatory? No. And this is where I differ from many in our church culture. This is where I catch flack, because the church culture is a conflation between the two. It was not always thus, as some of this data has pointed out, right? It was not always thus. It was not always the prophet or whatever. There was a different perception. But in the past half century plus, we've had this change where the prophet, our prophet, 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 prophet. And it's reduced our ability to kind of say, well, what does that mean? Like, is everything coming from this individual prophecy? Where is the prophecy? I've done musings before about we've basically had like zero modern revelation since Joseph Smith, with these minute exceptions that are often more political PR type statements turned into supposed, prophecy than actual prophecy. So you can go to sundaymusings.org. You can filter the drop down by prophet or revelation to find that past musing. So I love the idea. I support the idea. I believe the idea of modern prophets, and I don't cast any shade towards the leaders of the church, as many are wont to do when they have kind of this nuanced view, or they say, where's the revelation? Oh, shame on the leaders of the church. To me, my approach is shame on us, because I think the leaders of the church are an outgrowth and reflection of us as a church community. And when you look throughout the scriptures and the Lord is closing the mouth of prophets and not giving them revelation, so often, typically, always, it is the fault of the people. It is the wickedness and idolatry of the people. Now, that doesn't mean that the church leaders are off the hook themselves. Isaiah and Jeremiah have very stern things to say about, prophets who purport to speak for God who actually aren't, and who are allowing other people to perceive their statements and words as being from the mouth of God when it actually isn't. There's some really potent things in those books, particularly in Jeremiah. So I'm not letting leaders off the hook, but I'm not letting us off the hook. I think this is a shared problem where we have fallen. This is in my Slow Stain book that came out a couple months ago. So you can find that at socialharmony.org or at Amazon. That's maybe the overall contention of that book, is that we have slowly embraced idolatry, embraced wickedness. We have fallen as a people from the potential that we have to rise to a much higher level that Joseph was struggling even in his day, where the Lord is condemning the church and Joseph is saying the saints fly to pieces of like glass the moment that he tries to introduce any new doctrine. We've struggled with this, we collectively. So it's not just, oh, shame on you, Salt Lake and church leaders, right? But I do think as a culture, it is improper for us to brand someone like I don't know. Joseph Smith is, in my mind, very anomalous because of the amount of prophecy, the presumption that when he was speaking spiritual things and communicating like that it was prophecy, that it was revelatory. I mean, look at all the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, and look at the Book of Mormon and the inspired translation of the Bible and all the rest. So in my mind, there's an abundance of evidence to call him the prophet, as the saints long did. But to apply that title to other individuals for whom we lack that evidence, who have not shown that God has provided them that same revelatory, communication and abundance of knowledge to share with the saints, and so on and so on, I personally am a little reserved with that. I don't want to just be flinging around the prophet, the prophet, the prophet. Again, do I sustain the president of the church as prophecy and revelator? Yes, I want more prophecy. I want us to be righteous enough to receive that. It's like people in the testimony meeting saying, "Oh, I felt the Spirit and it helped me find my keys." Like, okay, does God help us find lost things? Yes. I'm not going to say that that's not, how God helps us. But when we reduce it to this like base level of whatever, same thing with like prophecy. You ask people, all right, where's recent prophecy? And they'll be like, oh, 2 Hour Church, or, oh, come follow me, or oh, we did home-centered church-supported church just prior to COVID, and these tiny little like car key level administrative changes and things that look, was some of that inspired? Probably it definitely was. Is that prophecy? Is that just inspired administration of church programs versus, so maybe I swing my pendulum farther than most in being a little more reserved in saying prophecy or the prophet or prophetic counsel. But I do feel like culturally as a church, the pendulum is totally in an inappropriate direction where it's just the prophet, the prophet, the prophet. And this is a new thing. This is not, Quinn was right. This is not a long-standing thing. This is a culturally recent thing. For example, uh, again, I did that past musing on changing Mormon catchphrases, which you can find at sundaymusings.org. Uh, and one of them I chose was prophetic counsel. This is one of the ones that uh, that has come into vogue in recent years. Here is the image, the number of references in General Conference, again, using that ldsgeneralconference.org resource. And what's fascinating about this is the increase of usage in the term prophetic counsel is very much in line with the decrease in references to our president. So just as leaders of the church are transitioning away from saying the president or our president, and they're instead shifting in the direction in the 80s and 90s and ever since to the prophet and our prophet / our beloved prophet, so too you see prophetic counsel, right? We don't have presidential counsel. I should have looked that term up. It's probably never been said at all in General Conference. And just for kicks, I'm actually going to do this live right now. I'm going to pull up the internet. Presidential counsel. The term has never been used in General Conference. So we've got this general conference use of prophetic counsel that has increased in recent decades, as have the references to our prophet and the prophet. And I guess my overarching point here is that I think we need to bring back the president title as the primary one used and not implicitly bestow a prophetic title without evidence of prophecy. I recognize that in our church culture, that is something controversial to say. I recognize that it's perceived as borderline apostate to not follow lockstep and follow the prophet, period. But again, like, was the church true and the gospel true for like its first century and a half or century plus when that wasn't how it was done? That wasn't how it was perceived. That isn't how people communicated. Why did we engage in this transition? Is Quinn and Young, are they right in that shift around McKay and thereafter Joseph Fielding Smith was born of kind of political inclinations to try and have a church membership that would more toe the line? Maybe. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. They've got their arguments around the ERA and other things, the frustration of church leaders to not have the saints following their political prescriptions and preferred candidates. And there are fair arguments to make in that regard as to why church leaders may have felt a desire to figure out how do we get more people in line. And perhaps that led to some type of strategic decision of, hey, we're going to minimize references to president and we're going to amplify references to prophet so that church members are more likely to think that what is said over the pulpit or in the Deseret News is prophetic, et cetera, et cetera. It could be that at some point in some meeting that was decided. I don't know. I do know that the trends are very clear, that our president and the president have cratered, like completely cratered, after being the predominant way that leaders of the church were referenced, that references to those presidents of the church did at times include a prophet or prophet, seer, and revelator, but they were more, I'll say, modest and light in reference, which to me is prudent because it kind of shows, okay, well, yeah, that's the president of the church. You're kind of the administrative organizational leader. We sustain you as prophet, seer, and revelator, but we have some, not hesitance. What's the word I'm looking for? We have just a little bit of restraint around how we're flinging around the word prophet and how much is prophetic. Now, having said all of that, it could have also been a cultural thing for them to call the leader the president, and that was just part of their cultural thing. And yet, members of the church at the time, despite calling him president, still had this presumption of prophetic counsel out of everything coming out of his mouth. I think Quinn and others make a fair argument that looking at how often the counsel of the president of the church was disregarded seems to suggest that that sentiment didn't really exist. That members didn't feel that they had to follow the counsel and the non theological type of ideas and prescriptions from leaders of the church opining on civic and political matters. So it's unlikely, I think, that the saints at the time, despite saying the president or our president, still had this like follow the prophet type of thing. I think that's been much more recent. And therefore, absent some clear revelation from God saying, you need to stop calling him president, you need to start calling him the prophet, you need to presume that everything is prophetic coming out of his mouth, that all of his counsel is, quote, prophetic counsel. Absent a revelation on that, absent very clear direction from God, I feel like this is just cultural drift. And therefore, I resist it. Not because I'm going apostate, not because I dislike the leaders of the church, not because I have an axe to grind or I want to steady the ark or I want to, just that I want to be very deliberate in what I believe and how I act and who I follow and what is from God. I want to follow everything from God, 100%. Like that is my sincere desire. But plenty of people have gone astray by following individuals who were presumed to be speaking for God 100% of the time, but actually weren't. Do I think that means that the president of the church is trying to lead us astray intentionally? Not at all. It's just that I don't believe that everything from a president of the church is actually prophecy, is actually revelatory from God. I think presidents of the church, like everyone else, are fallible individuals with personal opinions. I think administrative decisions are made collectively by men we sustain as prophets, seers, and revelators, and yet those decisions are truly just administrative in nature, though well-intentioned and etc. So I just want to be very cautious. I don't want the semantic satiation of prophet, 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 right? I don't want to dilute the awesomeness of the idea that we have the opportunity for modern prophecy, direct revelation from God, guidance in our day and age. That is such an amazing doctrine and opportunity, but I don't want to dilute it by presuming that, it was prophetic counsel that everyone should, get the COVID shot and wear a mask or pick your issue, right? Not everything. Like there's a delta, there's a difference. Not everything that's comes from the president of the church is prophetic. And I think we collectively run into problems when we conflate the two. I know many people who have had deep, significant problems with their testimony. Their testimony has been very shaken because they were conflating the two. And when they came to the conclusion that a particular administrative action or organizational position or whatever was incorrect, or that they didn't apply to their life, or they weren't going to implement and follow 100%, these people struggle in their faith because they had conflated that, well, that must be the prophet. Therefore, wait a minute, he said something that I don't believe is from God. And therefore, what does this mean? And it's because in recent decades, by saying the prophet, the prophet, the prophet, the prophet, prophetic counsel, we don't give a space for these individuals to be non-prophetic, right? We don't even give them space to like wear a t-shirt and jeans. Like they go to like a sports thing or a whatever, and it's like suit and tie. You must be prophetic looking at all times. It's like, let the person chill. They're just a person, Joseph Smith himself, a prophet is not always a prophet, only when acting as such, right? We have to be very cautious in this regard. And I think too cavalierly, people are just flinging around the prophet term. So to me, this is an interesting question. I think that meme is wrong, right? That's not from Quinn. That's from Neil Young. Neil Young cites Quinn, but in doing so, makes incorrect claims that it's the Deseret News and not the church news, or that the term prophet was only for Joseph Smith when that's not true. Quinn himself, I think, is reading a little bit too much into some of these articles, but overall, I think he's dead on, and that there is this shift. There is this transition in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to the point where in the 80s and beyond, you've got almost no references to president, and they're all the prophet, our prophet. Now, you could come away from this saying, well, I think that's all true and good and from God. Well, okay, I would challenge you and say, how do we know? Where was the conscious decision? Where was a revelation? Where was a church teaching that we have confirmation is from God, that we should stop using president and we should start using prophet? I just think it's cultural drift, and therefore I think it needs to be articulated so that we can observe the data and the trend and try and figure out Was that an appropriate thing? Or is it part of the slow stain kind of incremental stuff that we fall into, that God's children have long and always fallen into, where we just have these little incremental things that end up causing us spiritual complications because we did not consciously see this shift from one thing to another? It was just this slow drift. So all of this is to say that is why I am measured and circumspect in how I use the term prophet, that I believe, I agree with Joseph Smith that a man is only a prophet when acting as such. I believe that requires us to have the spirit of discernment to know when that is. I don't believe we ought to presume that everything said in the ensign or over the pulpit or in official church letterhead, etc., is suddenly prophetic. I believe there's a wide range of communications that can and do happen from the president of the church that are presidential, you might say, but are not prophetic. Now, you and I might disagree on where that applies and which ones that is. And I think that's the whole point. We have to use our brains. We have to use spiritual discernment. God wants us to come and let us reason together, as it says in Doctrine and Covenants. I think we become spiritually weak when we just passively assume that everything is prophetic counsel. It doesn't require us to flex our spiritual muscles. It doesn't require us to discern and to develop that gift of the Spirit. And it places us in spiritual danger when there is an administrative decision with which we diverge or disagree or might be wrong itself. And because we've conflated the two, now we have a spiritual problem, not just an organizational disagreement. Tell me what you think in the comments. I'm very eager to hear what y'all have to say. This is a tough topic in our culture. It's one that I find myself treading carefully in because many people have very strong sensibilities. But I hope, at least in seeing the data, we can at least pause and say, well, if this is only a thing in the past few decades, maybe those who have a different sentiment, like Connor, are not just inherently to be branded as whatever, because, you know, had I had my same views in the 1940s, that would have been just like, apparently, in vogue, right? That would have been like the way that everyone else pretty much was operating. But we've had this church culture shift, and the data, I think, bears that out. Tell me what you think in the comments. I'll see you there, and I'll see you next week.